Yeah, thank you so much for receiving to the VTV station and discuss more about the climate change in Vietnam.
Well,
So
thank you
much.
for the invitation to your talk show.
Yeah. And the first question I would like to ask the purpose of your visits to Vietnam and your observation on Vietnam development, please.
Well, it is very well known in the international world that Vietnam is currently in the process of a transition in its energy system. It has come from a background of heavy presence of coal and is now considering what are the options for Vietnam as it moves forward in order to maintain its economic growth, its energy security, and of course its competitiveness as a hub for manufacturing for Asia and for the world. So it is a very important moment in the consideration of the government as to how Vietnam is going to move forward into its energy transition, and that is why we're here to lend our support to the energy transition.
Yeah, thank you so much. So is this the says that Vietnam is one of the countries that is being affected by climate change. So how renewable do you think the Vietnamese community will be due to the impact of climate change?
Vietnam is definitely one of the countries that is affected. Sadly, there is no country that is not affected. And sadly, every single country has felt over the past 2 to 5 to 10 years has felt the negative impact of climate change. And here in Vietnam, I think the most recent impacts have been the impacts of drought and flooding in the Mekong Delta that are well known within Vietnam, but also outside of Vietnam.
Yeah. So, Mr. Christiana Fugueres, after the Copenhagen conference COP 13, no, 15, right? Yeah, and in 2008, 2009, a number of years has passed to reach consensus among countries trying a historic 2015 agreement in Paris. So could you share with us your feeling when the agreement was approved?
Well, of course, it was a very important moment for the world, and I think every single TV camera in the world was focused on that moment of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, where so many thousands of people who had worked for the Paris Agreement were really so happy they even cried of happiness to get the agreement. But I tell you which was the most important moment for me. It was not the moment of the adoption. It was actually 2 weeks before that, when even before the COP had started, I was invited by the religious communities of the world to receive a scroll with 1.8 million signatures from people around the world, people who I will never know, people from every walk of life, from every country in the world, 1.8 million signatures from people who not only wanted a Paris Agreement, they wanted an ambitious Paris Agreement that would safeguard the future for them and for their children.
So at the moment, is this a very hard time for you?
Was it a hard time?
Yeah.
Well, I would say I had a hard time for 6 years. It's not one moment. The Paris Agreement was definitely not reached in one moment or in 1 year. It was built through the continuous confidence building among countries and among other stakeholders, the finance world, the private sector, that continued to build confidence in each other that they would be able to reach an agreement, and that agreement would be a good thing for everyone.
Yeah. So in order to convene 1,095 countries,
195.
yeah, to ratify such an important commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emission was possible, very difficult with you and your colleague. So how did you manage to eventually build a common consensus among the country?
I think the most important factor that built consensus was to understand that while we have a common goal, because we have one common planet that we're all intending on staying on, while that is absolutely true, there is also space for every country to find its own particular contribution to that common goal through its own national interests. And it was the combination of finding the national interests and the national potential to that common goal that consensus was actually being built.
So you know that Vietnam joined the COP21 meeting with the former Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng.
Correct.
Presentation with the commitment of Vietnam to contribute $1 million to the Green Climate Fund, which is worldwide recognized as one of the good efforts. Why many developing countries are determined to keep their view on financing for the climate change adaptation in developing countries? It is the responsibility of the developed country, given the fact that Vietnam is still a developing country, but has made a specific commitment on finance to contribute to clean on the dialogue on this issue in the climate change negotiation in the COP21. So what do you think about the role of Vietnam at the COP21?
Well, we are of course very grateful for the participation and the very positive leadership of Vietnam, as you say, in the person of the Prime Minister. We were very blessed to have 150 heads of state who personally came to Paris at the beginning of the COP to ensure that the representatives of the governments who were negotiating the last details would actually end up in an agreement and in consensus. So we're certainly grateful for that. And with respect to financing, I think it was a very important message that was sent there by the Prime Minister, because it is absolutely clear that the historical responsibility and the historical roots of climate change rest squarely with this responsibility with industrialized countries. It is the burning of fossil fuels on the part of those countries that has caused climate change up until now. But as the Prime Minister himself put forward through his contribution to the Green Climate Fund, there was a very important recognition that while historical responsibility cannot be questioned, the future responsibility is a future responsibility that all countries share. Every single country, small, large, north, south, east, and west, now has a responsibility that is a different responsibility for each country, obviously, but there is a shared responsibility among all countries to contribute to the solution into the future.
Yeah, Vietnam considers climate change is a vital issue. Vietnam has mobilized the entire political system to respond. Therefore, the participation and full implementation of the Paris Agreement will deal with the root causes of climate change. So it will receive the support and contribute of the Vietnamese ministry, authority, local authority, enterprise and organization and people. So what do you think about the commitment to implement the Paris Agreement of Vietnam? From your observation, how to turn political commitment into concrete action commitment?
Well, there's no doubt that Vietnam continues to be committed to reaching the pledge and the contribution that they registered under the Paris Agreement. There's no doubt about that. I think the more important part of the conversation is building on that possibility. What else can Vietnam do? And so as Vietnam prepares for its eighth power development plan, and as Vietnam prepares for the 2018 negotiation of the climate convention, where all countries will come to the table to assess what they have been able to do and what more they can do. The important point here is to understand that in 2015, all countries put on the table what they could see at that point in time. But that since then, we have in the solution space, in renewable energies, we have a dramatic drop in costs. We have capital that has been shifting. We have policy that has been shifting. So there are many, many more possibilities available now to industrialize, but also, most importantly, to developing countries than were visible 3 years ago. And that is the space that Vietnam is now exploring to decide on the part of the government how much more would they want to do.
So, so this is the story, politic story. So say something about this pupil story. What do you think about the role of the pupil community, including businesses, in participating in addressing greenhouse gas emission?
Well, I think everyone has a responsibility and everybody has an opportunity to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And very specifically, I think you asked about business, right?
Yeah.
Very specifically, business has actually woken up, and together with governments, they have reached the conclusion that perhaps 10 years ago we saw climate change as a burden and as a cost, and now we understand that the measures that governments can take and the investments that businesses can make are actually no longer a burden and a cost, but actually are, if you are a government, they're good for your economy because it strengthens the economy, and if you're a business, they are actually profitable businesses. So the context for engagement with climate change has dramatically changed over the past 5 years, and that is a very good thing.
Yeah, and follow the question about the COP21. So in the report of Vietnam on the COP21 says that on the mission reduce target, Vietnam is committed to reducing unconditioned emission of the 8% by 2030 compared to the convention development scenario and 25,000 conditional emission reduction if support
25%.
Yeah, 25% conditional emission reduction if supported by Blazon and multilateral international cooperation. I think that over 1 year that this commitment is to be affected. So what is your view of the roadmap in terms of realizing the commitment of country in the world as well commitment of Vietnam?
Well, I think the good news is that those numbers that Vietnam put in and registered under the Paris Agreement are actually not difficult numbers. That's a very good news because Vietnam has been able already to reap benefits both in energy efficiency as well as in renewable energy so that they can very easily reach their 8%. So that is no longer the question. The question now is, as we move forward, what else can Vietnam do to strengthen its economy,
Yes.
to be more energy independent? That is the really important question. And with respect to the 25% with international help, I actually think that 25% is very low because I think that there will be an extraordinary willingness on the part of international actors, both public and private, particularly private investment, that are just waiting for policy clarity in Vietnam in order to be able to dedicate their resources to the energy transition in Vietnam. So I think that those numbers were very good for the time being for 2015, but they can definitely be revised.
Yes, as you know, the Mekong Delta of Vietnam is very rich, but sensitive area. It is also one of the 3 delta in the world most affected by climate change and sea level rise. The Conference on Sustainable Development of Mekong Delta Adaptation and Climate Change, organized under the chairmanship by Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, was organized and recorded many views on the contribution of the scientists and experts from Vietnamese and international organizations. So, as a person with a lot of experience working with the renewable plan due to impact of climate change, what advice would you have for reducing the risk of climate change?
Well, I think the risk of climate change needs to be reduced on two parallel tracks. The first is there needs to be, and I'm sure that that already exists in the Mekong Delta, the identification of what adaptation measures, which are absolutely urgent, need to be put in place in order to protect the productivity and the livelihoods of those who live there. And that, I would say, is primal and absolutely urgent. At the same time, the best way to reduce the risk of the Mekong Delta is actually to not incur into any more carbon-based energy generation, because it is precisely the coal generation, the burning of the coal, not just in Vietnam, but in the world, that has been the most powerful culprit and the most powerful influence on causing climate change. So if you're going to protect the Delta, you have to protect and address the causes of the problems in the Delta, and that is coal.
So could you analyze the consequence when we exhausted our fossil fuels energy resources?
Well, it is true that that Vietnam has some fossil fuel resources and reserves, but I believe that it is also true that given the very quick economic growth and energy demand growth that that Vietnam is expecting, yes, I believe that there is very quickly going to be the point in which Vietnam can no longer use its own fossil fuel reserves. So then the question is, what happens? So you have two tracks. Either you then import fossil fuels, be it coal from Australia or China, or you import gas or LNG from other countries, including the United States perhaps, but then you continue to have that energy dependence on those countries that need to be willing to export to you and to protect those transportation routes. That is one scenario. The other scenario is for Vietnam to realize what its potential is on its own locally based energy resources. And that is, of course, hydro, it is wind, and it is solar. And I don't think Vietnam has already started to learn its and increase its familiarity with those resources, but Vietnam has not finished that process. There is still much to be learned about the potential that those energy sources have for Vietnam, and particularly the potential that those resources have to make Vietnam a strong and energy independent country.
As you just said that in Vietnam we have many potential about the energy, renewable energy. So for Vietnam, mitigation options focus on the energy, agriculture, land use change, and forestry, and waste management. So what is your advice for promoting clean and renewable energy program for developing countries, including in Vietnam?
Well, I think there, as you mentioned, there are many mitigation options, and Vietnam needs to figure out which are the most cost-effective mitigation options. But I would say that top of the line needs to be, number one, energy efficiency. There is no point in wasting expensive electricity. That will become more expensive on the way, and because prices in Vietnam have been so low, there has not been any incentive to save electricity. So the first thing that needs to be done is to adjust those prices, in particular for high consumers, not for low consumers, but for high consumers, so that there is an industrial level incentive to perform energy efficiency measures that are win-win for everyone. They're win-win for manufacturing and win-win for the country. So energy efficiency would be at the top of my line. And then right behind that It is, as I said before, to really optimize all of the local energy sources that Vietnam has and maybe need to be complemented with some imported. But before you optimize and maximize everything, all the energy resources that Vietnam has in its own territory, under its own control, then I think that you don't need to quickly go outside, but rather focus on your own energy resources that are under your control.
So as you mentioned, when the challenge you have mentioned will be opportunity for investor and businesses to turn some of the challenges into viable to commercial project.
Yes, I do think that there's a long list, a long line of private sector companies, Vietnamese and international, that are very interested in investing because Vietnam is a very good investment country. It's very stable politically. It has excellent professional performance and standards. It is right in the center of Asia. It is has already grown enormously from being a low-income country to already a middle-income country, and will continue to grow. Yeah. So everything is lined up for the private sector to invest here, but the policy framework needs to be put in place in order to be able to attract that investment.
Yeah, it means the policy should be to open and to have a good conditional with the investor and business, right?
Well, the policy needs to be put in place that will, on the one hand, protect the national interest, yeah, because that is the first responsibility of any government. So you have to protect the national interest, but there also has to be that same policy needs to open the door, yeah, to private investment to come in particular in a country that has already maximized out its possibility to put itself into debt, and that now needs to move to a different kind of financing. So Vietnam has been able to take advantage of many years of indebtedness capacity, but now it can take advantage of private investment.
Yes, I hope in the near future we can open the door to welcome many investors in the international and who come to invest in Vietnam. So in your view, in the issue of the energy saving and energy efficiency, how can be strengthened and promoted?
Energy efficiency,
yes,
price.
Yes.
It's definitely about the price. You will not save anything that is cheap, and that's very human behavior. Yeah. If something is very cheap to me and very easy, then there's no incentive to save. So the moment that you begin to truly price electricity at the real cost, and in particular that you begin to segment the market so that you can focus the increase of price on the high-level users, on the high-quantity users, big manufacturing companies who will not leave Vietnam. They will not leave Vietnam, A, because the price here is lower than anyone else and they're used to paying higher prices, but also because of all of the other advantages that Vietnam has. So once you put the price up to the real price of electricity, then there's a motivation to do energy efficiency.
Yeah, so interesting. So the last question, what are some of the international experience to date for developing countries which are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emission and adapt to climate change? What advice would you give, please?
Well, I think I never give advice to any country because I think everything that every country does is absolutely the decision of that government. What I think is helpful is to look at what other countries are doing. And here in Asia, I think one fascinating example is what India is doing. India is investing more and more into renewables because the way that they have structured the market makes solar much cheaper than coal. They are closing coal because of the huge health impacts and because the Indian citizens don't want the kind of pollution that coal produces. Same thing in the Mekong Delta. So they are closing coal and they are investing very, very much into renewables in order to move down the path of energy independence and cheaper electricity.
Yeah. And the last small question, could you give some short message for the viewer from VTV, for example, like me, and for the young relation, what should you do to protect environmental and to understand about the impact climate change? So what did you say?
Well, I don't think anybody is blind still to the impacts of climate change, certainly not in Vietnam when you have the experience that you had last year. And the bad news is that is not the last time that you will have evidence. You will have more evidence on climate change. So the only thing you need to do on climate change to understand it is open up your eyes and see what is happening. With respect to what we can all do, we can all be certainly much more aware of the energy that we consume, whether that is for lighting, whether that is for cooling, whether that is for transportation. We have grown up with the sense that energy is always going to be there. And the only thing that we know about energy is you go to the switch and you flip the switch and there you have electricity. But you never think about the consequences of this. So I think that as the next generation does have the need to become much more aware of where it's the energy coming from and what are the consequences of that energy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's many information and your story come to here, maybe to help the viewer and help me to understand about the climate change, and we maybe change behavior to protect the environment and protect the cell. I think it's good for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Ok anh ơi, em xong rồi.